Airing first on Asheville FM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Salagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week I speak with JN, an anarchist who works with the leftist HongKonger platform Lausan, talking about where the uprising against Chinese integration in Hong Kong stands, the national security law, tankie and right-wing narratives, and international anti-authoritarian solidarity and resistance. But first, two brief announcements. I'd like to remind folks that the 2020 Republican National Convention is going to be partially held in Charlotte, North Carolina from August 20th through the 24th. One group that is doing anti-repression work in the area is Charlotte Uprising, which can be found on Twitter at CLT Uprising, where you can find info about the protests and the events as well as their jail support, including how to make donations. You can learn more by following the hashtags Charlotte Uprising and ResistRNC 2020. Secondarily, here's an announcement from Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, which is calling for solidarity from August 21st to September 9th on the outside to amplify prisoners' human rights. Quote, "To all in solidarity with the prisoners' human rights movement, we are reaching out to those that have been amplifying our voices in the state, federal, or immigration jails and prisons, and to the allies that uplifted the national prison strike demands in 2018. We call on you again to organize the communities from August 21st to September 9th, 2020, by hosting actions, events, and demonstrations that call for prisoner human rights and an end to prison slavery. We must remind the people and legal powers in this nation that prisoners' human rights are a priority. If we aren't moving forward, we're moving backwards. For those of us in chains, backwards is not an option. We have nothing to lose but our chains." Some people claim that prisoners' human rights have advanced since the last national prison strike in 2018. We strongly disagree. But due to prisoners organizing inside and allies organizing beyond the walls, solidarity with our movements has increased. The only reason we hear conversations referencing prison reforms in every political campaign today is because of the work of prison organizers and our allies. But as organizers in prison, we understand that this is not enough. Just as quickly as we've gained ground, others are already funding projects and talking points to set back those advances. Our only way to hold our ground while moving forward is to remind people where we are and where we are headed. On August 21st through September 9th, we call on everyone in solidarity with the prison class struggle to organize an action, a panel discussion, a rally, an art event, a film screening, or any other kind of demonstration to promote prisoners' human rights. Whatever is within your ability, we ask that you shake the nation out of any fog they may be in about prisoners' human rights and the criminal legal system, aka legalized enslavement. During these solidarity events, we request that organizers amplify immediate issues prisoners in your state face, the demands from the National Prison Strike of 2018, and uplift Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, new international law project. We started the International Law Project to engage the international community with a formal complaint about human rights abuses in U.S. prisons. This project will seek prisoners' testimonials from across the country to establish a case against the United States prison industrial slave complex on international human rights grounds. Presently working on this legally is the National Lawyers Guild's attorneys of the Mass Incarceration Committee Working Group and another attorney, Anne LaBarbera, members of the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, or IWOC, Fight Toxic Prisons, and I Am We Prisoners Advocacy Network / Millions of Prisoners are also working to support these efforts. The Mass Incarceration Committee Working Group, Jennifer R. Jones, Esquire, and Audrey Bomsey, will be taking lead on this project. The national prison strike demands of 2018 have not changed. As reflected publicly by the recent deaths of Mississippi prisoners, the crisis in this nation's prisons persists. Mississippi prisons are on national display at the moment of this writing, and we know shortly afterward there will be another Parchman in another state with the same issues. The U.S. has demonstrated a reckless disregard for human lives in cages. The prison strike demands were drafted as a path to alleviate the dehumanizing process and conditions people are subjected to while going through this nation's judicial system. Following up on these demands communicates to the world that prisoners are heard and that prisoners' human rights are a priority. In the spirit of Attica, will you be in the fight to dismantle the prison industrial slave complex by pushing demands that will shut down jails and prisons like Rikers Island and Attica? Read the Attica Rebellion demands and read the National Prison Strike 2018 demands. Ask yourself what you can do to see the 2018 National Prison Strike demands through. Share this release far and wide with all your contacts. We rage with George Jackson's Blood in My Eyes and move in the spirit of the Attica Rebellion. So thanks a lot for taking the time to chat. Would you please introduce yourself for the audience with a name if you want, preferred gender pronouns, and say something about your relationship to Hong Kong and the struggle against the extradition law there?
Yeah, my name is JN, he, him pronouns. I'm part of Lausan Collective, but I'm speaking for myself for this interview. So I was born in Hong Kong and I have residency there, but I have been at a distance from the protests. So, you could kind of call this being part of the diaspora if you want, but that term is, to me, kind of tricky, and it does a lot more to obscure our relationships to home more than it does to clarify. So, I like to just say I'm at a distance from the protests.
Okay.
Since they began.
Cool. And can you tell listeners a little bit about Lausan HK? What positions does it hold? Who writes for it, and what its goal is?
Yeah, I'll speak kind of briefly about Lausan since, I'm not really speaking on the behalf of the collective in this interview, but just in general, Lausan has members with different leftist-oriented positions from, anarchist to more social democratic. So this has been kind of a lot to work through, as you can imagine. But I think it also reflects, actually, the necessity of Hong Kong's political condition and also that of the political condition of, Hong Kongers outside of Hong Kong, which is that there really hasn't been many or even any internationalist groups that focus on Hong Kong from a radical and or leftist perspective. So my belief is that we're really helping to build the foundation for that to happen, which means that we're going to be bringing in a lot of folks with different views along the leftist spectrum, which I'm quite happy about, to be honest. There is kind of like an anarchist faction of Lausan, but it definitely doesn't characterize the entire group. So we kind of filter our goals through three main pillars, which is like we do organizing. We used to do a lot of on-the-ground organizing before the pandemic. Now it's kind of shifted online and doing webinars and stuff. And we also do a lot of writing, as you can see from the website, and also translation. And, really, to me, translation is one of the beating heart of Lausan, because we aim to create international solidarity with leftists around the world. So to sum it up, kind of like helping leftists around the world to understand Hong Kong, which I think is a really important job because not much of that has been done. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding. But the flip side of that is to amplify leftist voices in Hong Kong outward, and then also translating leftist work from places around the world so that it can be read in Chinese in Hong Kong. So it's kind of an educative project, I think, and translation is so key to that.
Where are you on the political spectrum, just so I have an understanding?
I identify as anarchist.
So I was going to ask a question about where the demonstrations were at this moment, or how they've been affected by the lockdown. And I'd still like to, and COVID-19, and I'd still like to ask that. But for the sake of listeners who are maybe not so familiar with what's been going on in Hong Kong or need a refresher, could you give a real brief reintroduction to what sparked off the protests last year and what sort of those look like in comparison to past movements in Hong Kong?
Yeah, sure. The Final Straw interview that Kok did with you all last year is already such an amazing primer. So I guess to start off, I would send people to that interview because I think it's so incredible. But I guess my little 2-minute primer would be something like the 2014 umbrella movement was what really brought Hong Kong to the world stage. It was generally a peaceful protest, and it was an occupation of the main thoroughfares of Hong Kong and also kind of the central financial district of Hong Kong. And, it lasted for 79 days, and then the police routed the occupation. And that was really kind of like a low point for social movements in Hong Kong, because the goal of that movement was to press for universal suffrage, and none of the official goals were achieved. And so I would say protest and activism kind of entered a period of abeyance. A lot of folks who were really invested in the umbrella movement just couldn't see a way forward. So for a while, not much was happening. happening, or not at that level at least. So in 2019, the anti-extradition bill, just a very quick summary of that, was that the Hong Kong government tabled a bill that was like a precursor to the national security law that basically sparked from a HongKonger who murdered his girlfriend in Taiwan and then came back to Hong Kong. So the proposal was to set up an extradition bill so that this person could face justice. And it was kind of a flimsy pretext because extradition wasn't really necessary to begin with to address this. And many of the detractors of the extradition bill said that this was just a way for China to extend its legal system into Hong Kong. And so there was a lot of fear around this. In 2003, just to go back, there was an initial introduction of a national security law by the Hong Kong government. And there were, massive protests against that. And eventually the government was forced to shelve the law. And so I think, this fear over national security and the kind of opaque legal and criminal justice, quote unquote, system in China has been kind of burning in the background in Hong Kong for quite some time. And so those fears, all the way from 2003 up until now had kind of exploded when this extradition bill was proposed. And, I'm not going to go through the whole, movement, but basically from, like June until December, there was just, massive participation in this uprising across all of Hong Kong. At some point there was a rally of 2 million people out on the streets. And there was an increase in street fighting with police amongst young people. And in contrast to the umbrella movement, which was about like occupation and holding a location, this movement, I'm sure many folks have already heard about the be water ethos that, inspired by Bruce Lee, where it's not so much about, holding a position, but it's really about moving with the different situations, since police were more willing to crack down even on like peaceful marches, rallies, that type of thing. So that eventually turned into this kind of like guerrilla type street fighting. And it was really about trying to wear out police by moving around as much as possible. Thus the be water thing. And so then the pandemic, it hit Hong Kong in the beginning of January. And that was kind of a very convenient pretext for the Hong Kong government to ban all public gatherings. And that really kind of put a damper on the movement. But Hong Kong got the virus under control quite quickly, and not through any help of the government. Actually, a lot of people-driven public health and safety. So everyone wore a mask, everyone did what they should, wash their hands, social distance, etc. And it was really in spite of the government that this happened. And so since the virus was controlled quite quickly, then, the movement started becoming active again. And that's when the national security law started to be floated, because, China and the Hong Kong government saw that the movement was starting back up.
Just to sort of shift to the personal for a moment, as the U.S. began recognizing numbers of folks infected with the pandemic within the U.S., there were and have been continued to be racist statements from the White House and from some portions of the U.S. population, basically attributing the disease to folks from Asia. And I was wondering if you had experienced any Western chauvinism in relation to the pandemic in this sort of way.
Yeah, I live in a large metropolitan area on the West Coast of the US, but I've been, really fortunate to not be subject to any of the physical violence that other East Asian presenting people have faced, like in New York and in LA as well. But, when I am out, I have seen white people kind of like clutching their mask closer to their face when they pass me and a group of other Asian folks. Like, I'm not sure what clutching your mask closer to your face is supposed to accomplish, but I think that's actually making things worse. But, they do that, and then I can see them kind of like letting go after they feel like they've passed by us far enough. A white woman in my apartment looked like she was trying to like disappear into the walls of an elevator when I got on. And, everyone was wearing a mask in all of these scenarios, like the people, the white people and me and my friends, right? So, it's hasn't been anything so explicit as an attack, but it's just kind of out there in the background for sure.
Yeah. There's like the internalization of racist ideologies. It's interesting how it's interesting and often a little less terrifying when it just comes out as a subconscious response as opposed to like a conscious like attempt to attack. But it's still like, that sucks. I'm sorry. But
yeah.
Well, would you talk about the legacy of Western capitalism and British colonialism and the stratification of life in Hong Kong? That was one thing that the conversation with Akok I felt like didn't really touch on, which I had read about before, was the extremely high cost of living and the precarity in workplaces and just stratification across life in Hong Kong, the difficulty of living there. And I'm wondering if those instances have been challenged by the uprising in Hong Kong, if there's been calls for improvement, like the linking of day-to-day struggles for survival with a vision of a new alternative to either Chinese state capitalism or the legacies of neoliberal British capitalism.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think for the most part, the political dimension of the uprising has taken center stage. And I think many protesters see that as the primary struggle, right? Like the struggle against authoritarianism, the struggle against Chinese colonialism. I believe that this is colonial repression of Hong Kong. I know other people see it differently, but I really believe that. And there's a kind of cultural colonialism element of like trying to erase the language, trying to erase certain elements of the culture that are kind of known to be like very important to Hong Kongers, right? So that's why I see it that way. But in terms of the economic element of the protests, it's definitely there. I just think that it's taken a backseat to the fight against authoritarianism. Even though they're obviously interlinked, I think a lot of folks see it as like, we have to take care of this, the most pressing thing first, and then we can start tackling the other issues, which that's one analysis. I don't particularly agree with that, but that's out there, and I respect folks who kind of prioritize in that way, right? But I think one thing that's frequently overlooked is the demographic makeup of the uprising. So it's true that a good number of the protesters are under 30 and have post-secondary education, which, a lot of people just take at face value and say, oh, okay, this is a bourgeois movement, not worth supporting. But this ignores the fact that post-secondary education, for example, is often subsidized with low-cost loans from the government. It also ignores the fact that a vast majority of Hong Kongers are forced to live at home with their family well into their 30s because of skyrocketing housing prices, which you mentioned. If you can imagine that, it's already starting to creep into places in the US as well, that this type of like living at home longer. But it's even more impossible in Hong Kong to buy your own place, let alone to rent one, right? The minimum wage in Hong Kong is $4.83 US. And this happened I think it happened in 2011, that this minimum wage was instituted. And it's even less for migrant domestic workers. So there's very little worker protection. Many times people frequently work close to 80 hours a week just to get by. So I think this makes the claim that some Western leftists make that, it's just a bourgeois movement. I think is pretty laughable. Under these extreme conditions of repression, well-documented cases of many people living in those what's called coffin homes. They're basically just cages. It's an apartment that's subdivided to the extreme, and then people have to live in cages so that they can keep their possessions safe and themselves safe. I've been in types of apartments like that.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm talking with JN, an anarchist originally from Hong Kong, about the national security law and the state of the uprising there.
All of these conditions are directly inherited from the British colonial period. So, for example, the legislative council that the British colonial regime set up is dominated by corporate business interests by design, right? So they specifically pick people to fill these seats from the business class to represent business interests. So, and the Chinese regime, when they took over in 1997, they kept this political structure wholesale, because they knew they wanted to use it to enrich themselves and the corporate and political elite in the same way, right? There's often this claim that Chinese nationalists make, which is like we're decolonizing Hong Kong, we're getting rid of British colonial structures, et cetera, et cetera. But, they kept all of the British laws, they kept the British colonial political structure and the British colonial police force, right? So all of these are in service of allowing capital to just flow across the border to Chinese tycoons now. And so, like living in these close quarters with family, it's not only stressful on a day-to-day basis, but it makes political action so much more difficult if a kid's parents, for example, don't share the same political commitments. There's been many instances of protesters who are either like low income or have become houseless because they've been thrown out by their parents for their political involvement. And so I think these crushing factors caused directly the hypercapitalist system is what's really the foundation of rage for the modern era of social movements in Hong Kong, beginning around 2003 with that first attempt at imposing a national security law. The economic element is there, it's just not expressed in the same way that is as legible for leftists in the West, which is like articulating all these economic demands, unionizing, although that the unionizing movement is really starting to blossom now as kind of a side effect of the fact that the street movement has been repressed so severely. But, this economic oppression is taking place all across the world, and that's why it's so important for us to boost and make these connections between Hong Kong's grievances and those of other people around the world. Like, I really believe that Hong Kongers are primed to not only use leftist tactics like unionization and strikes, which was attempted multiple times throughout this 2019 movement. And also, Hong Kong also has a long history of labor agitation as well. But, Hong Kongers are also primed to see their struggles as the same as leftists and anarchists around the world. I think we just have to do this connective work and this educative work on both sides. So, yeah, part of it is intertwined with the political question of like authoritarianism and colonialism. But, I can talk more about that when we talk about the national security.
Just to kind of push back and play like a devil's advocate, ostensibly the Chinese administration is called communist. So if they were actually like nudging towards a decolonization of Hong Kong and the high cost of living, the extraction of labor in that way were an expression of the former colonial status of Hong Kongers as subjects of the British Crown, could it be argued that once this decolonization is over, that the standard of living and the rights of workers under a communist regime could be much more improved?
Well, I think, it's possible to believe that if one doesn't actually recognize the structures that are in place that are being used by the Chinese Communist Party. So, for example, yes, they do retain that name, but so much of that is not even ideological. It's just for show, right? It's an attempt to show some sort of difference between China and the West, right? And we can definitely get to that later when we talk more about this so-called New Cold War. But for example, in 1997, when the Chinese regime took over Hong Kong, then the Chinese-backed trade union was, and then also the pro-Beijing politicians in the Legislative Council were the ones to push to break collective bargaining. They were the ones to remove that from negotiations during the Basic Law, making Hong Kong's mini constitution and all that. And even after the handover, they were the ones to oppose that, right? So if this were a genuine effort to decolonize, then you would think that would be one of the first things that would happen to start, extracting the colonial capitalist poison from Hong Kong, right? But that's absolutely not the case, because allowing widespread collective bargaining would destabilize the Chinese capitalist regime. Mm-hmm. So that's just one instance in which it's quite easy to prove that that's not the case.
Can you describe what the national security law is and what its implementation has looked like?
Yeah, so the national security law is it's a sweeping repressive set of laws that criminalize dissent across Hong Kong. So it ostensibly focuses on so-called subversion, terrorism, separatism, and foreign interference. It's written extremely broadly. so that it can apply to almost anything. The Chinese Communist Party's Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, the highest legislative body in China, took over directly from the Hong Kong government, violating the one country, two systems model, and said that they would impose a law with no consultation. In the basic law, which is Hong Kong's like mini constitution, it says that it's the Hong Kong government's role to implement a national security law. And so that's what happened in 2003 when they tried to, and then there was extreme pushback from the people. So now, clearly China has lost patience with this and said they're just going to do it. And so when they announced this, it was pushed forward extremely quickly. It was only discussed for 3 days amongst the National People's Congress. The details of the law weren't even made public until the day it went into effect. So there were pro-Beijing politicians in Hong Kong who were promoting this law without knowing what was in it. That's kind of how topsy-turvy this whole thing was. So it applies not only to people who have residency, who are living in Hong Kong, but also for visitors. So people who are tourists, for example, or people on some sort of like work visa or whatever. And even those who aren't even in Hong Kong, China. So people outside the borders of those two places. And Hong Kongers feared since 2003, it supersedes the extradition bill from 20 and how much it puts Hong Kongers at risk. And, so the implementation was lightning fast. And then I've been shocked at how quickly China has begun arrests under the national security laws. Like it was within days. I personally thought that they would give it a little bit, but they're clear that they want to implement and start using it right away to clamp down on the protests. And this ramped up to just 4 days ago when opposition lawmakers were arrested for, quote, soliciting foreign interference. And then the biggest pro-democracy media outlet, Apple Daily, was raided, and its owner and its CEO and staff were arrested.
Can you talk about this publisher in particular? Because they've gotten a lot of international attention from other media outlets in the West, at least. And maybe what its political stance is, like the Wikipedia page, for instance, described it as being pro-democracy, which is a pretty vague term. And just say a little bit about what the state of independent media in Hong Kong is at the moment as the national security law is really starting to ramp up.
Yeah, so, Apple Daily is the largest pro-democracy media outlet in Hong Kong. That's kind of just what it's known for. It has a huge readership across the yellow spectrum. So yellow meaning like supporting pro-democracy people in Hong Kong. So then there's like deep up radical means to fight for democracy. And then like light yellows, the peaceful protesters who do the marches and rallies. Apple Daily is kind of like, it's very popular with this subset of people. So speaking for myself, I don't like Apple Daily's politics because it tends to veer more conservative and in some cases xenophobic. Just being real, I'm not trying to, hide or burnish Apple Daily's image in any way. There was an infamous crowd-funded ad back in 2012 that represented mainland Chinese as locusts ready to devour Hong Kong. I am 100% against that type of xenophobia. And it has this foundation in a really kind of long history of exploitation of Hong Kong's resources. And that's part of why I see this as a colonial regime, the Chinese colonial regime, because there's no effort to stop what's called parallel trading, for example. It's like people come over the border and buy up all these necessary goods and then bring them back over the border to sell at a higher cost. And I don't think that's the fault of the people per se. It's the fault of the two governments who allow this to happen, right? And so all of that kind of contributes to this locust imagery, which is reprehensible, but it was a kind of very infamous incident in Apple Daily.
TFSR is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of Anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
I'm Kami.
And I'm Franz, and together we are co-hosts of the Doomer versus Bloomer podcast on the Channel Zero network.
Every week I'm going to complain about how the world is fucked, things are definitely going to get worse before they get better, and we're all probably going to die.
And I disagree with Kami and think that having hope is important. We can make things better, but only if we believe we can and put in all the effort we're able to into organizing against capitalism and the state.
Yeah, we'll see.
That's the core of our podcast, y'all. It's our shtick. We disagree.
Find our show on SoundCloud or wherever you find podcasts, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Doomer v. Bloomer.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm talking with JN, an anarchist originally from Hong Kong, about the national security law and the state of the uprising there. Yeah, I mean, that's like a really working class, like, low-level scam type thing of just, if someone's doing it on a very small scale, that it's a survival crime, if anything.
Right. And, I don't know if we can fully get into this, but it was like a lot of the focus of this parallel trading was baby formula, because there was the melamine baby formula scandal on the mainland where, toxic chemicals were mixed into baby formula and a lot of babies died. And so, people on the mainland didn't trust their own products, and they would go over to Hong Kong to buy, like, quote unquote, safer products, right? And so there's just like, it's all kind of government ineptitude and all across the board there. And, some of this issue also veers into like worser territory with like, quote unquote, birth tourism. A lot of women from the mainland would come to Hong Kong to give birth in Hong Kong hospitals to get the Hong Kong residency status for their child. But then, they were accused of using up hospital resources, right? When obviously the answer to this is to increase hospital resources, not to, start calling these people like anchor babies or whatever, right? So it's a long history that kind of got embedded into this like locust imagery that I think Apple Daily is known for kind of fomenting, which is not great. And so its owner, the media tycoon Jimmy Lai, has also been like a supporter of Trump. He's on record saying like only Trump can save Hong Kong and, all that kind of bullshit. So their politics are generally awful and nothing close to liberatory. But obviously we shouldn't go around letting media moguls tell us what to do politically anyway, right? But Apple Daily being raided and its owners arrested without warrant, the police claim they had a warrant, but they refused to show it. Right? So that's still political repression, and it's had a chilling effect across an already freezing Hong Kong media landscape. So, for example, the police only allowed media on site for the raid that, quote, like, hadn't interfered with police in the past, end quote. That's what the police said. So the landscape is already massively shifting. Like, there's already been self-censorship for many, many years. But this is the latest show of force that's showing, like, it's going to get worse. And in terms of independent media, there are outlets like Stand News, which is an all Chinese language media outlet, which has generally, better politics than Apple Daily. But, with the Apple Daily raid, reporting in Hong Kong is just now so much more dangerous than it was already. And I think independent media they have even less resources to make a stand, right, than Apple Daily did. So I think this is where we have an opportunity to really spotlight and boost stories coming out of Hong Kong as independent media ourselves, because it's so unsafe for folks living there to do so.
You mentioned like a sort of like pro-Trump position coming from Apple Daily and some of their coverage, and also this like kind of fake Cold War. So there's been a continued and unsurprising saber rattling from the Trump administration against China, and that's been basically since he got into office. He's been blaming China for taking American industry. It's like a very old far-right xenophobic trope in the United States. Can you talk about those quote-unquote like conflicts between the Trump and the Xi administration and offers of solidarity from reactionary U.S. Senator Ted Cruz, or sort of the reactionary connection in opposition to China's further taking over of Hong Kong?
Right. I mean, both sides, China and the U.S., are trying to portray the other side as somehow like the enemy of freedom, right? Despite the fact that they're both repressive capitalist regimes. And so that's what I was kind of mentioning before about how it's like this. It's this very kind of convenient thing for the post-70s China to continue to call itself the Communist Chinese Party, right? Chinese Communist Party. Because, for example, I'm not sure if you've heard, but it kind of made some waves a number of years ago, how there were a bunch of Maoist student groups who were doing a lot of labor agitation on the mainland. Yeah, so the most famous being the JASIC incident, which it was these students who were helping these factory workers agitate for more labor rights. And then they were, the regime was extreme in cracking down on that. Many were disappeared, and then they were forced to do confessions, false confessions, and then some are, missing to this day. They still haven't been found, right? So, the communist part of this name is it's nothing but show, in my opinion. And that's where this kind of like shadow play comes in between, quote unquote, democratic capitalist US and then the communist socialist anti-imperialist regime of China. The US obviously has a long history of violence and repression around the world and within its own borders with indigenous people. No one is denying that, and they've done more to harm people than any other nation. But that doesn't mean necessarily that China is automatically good, right? It's not just that we have one quote unquote bad guy, but China also is a settler colonial state, does repress its people, and with the Uyghur Muslim concentration camps and genocide, they're clearly more than willing to do the same things to indigenous people as the US is, right? Mm-hmm. So those who are seeking to downplay China's violence and settler colonialism are doing no one any favors except the Chinese oligarchs and authoritarian rulers. Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, Martha Blackburn, and Ted Cruz, all these GOP people have been just using the communist part of China, quote unquote, they've just been using it to burnish their own credentials by appearing to be anti-communist hawks, which is, it's about as absurd as Xi calling China communist, right? All of this is simply pandering to their own bases. It's unfortunate that a section of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Uprising, is taking these right-wingers at their word. But, just like in any social movement in the US, there's going to be division, factionalism, and disagreements over political analysis. So
I would imagine there are a lot of people that are taking almost any offer of solidarity in view of like China's military looming on the horizon or whatever, that they would take any number of different offers of solidarity at face value and sort of bolster them as a way of showing resistance. If they were getting offers of support from Putin or from any number of other leaders around the world, there's probably factions within the resistance in Hong Kong that would say, yeah, totally, like, look at these people over here, they've got good perspectives and they see the injustice of this situation, they got our back. Is that unfair?
Right. Yeah, totally. And that's why I don't agree with that analysis at all, because it's kind of like a realpolitik thing. This is the thing that a lot of authoritarian leftists or tankies love to spotlight, is the small number of Hong Kong dissidents who play the realpolitik game, right? Like they meet up with US politicians, all that stuff. And I don't agree with it, and I don't think it's going to be effective in any way. But a lot of these folks, they see it as a lot of folks almost see it as trolling China, right? Like waving US flags around and wearing Trump masks and stuff like that. It's like they see it as almost like accelerationism, right? It's just kind of like, let's push this as far as it's going to go and see what happens, because I think it's underwritten by a sense of hopelessness, right?
The administration of Hong Kong for quite a while has been, like, in large part, like the legislature has a majority of seats that are taken up by pro-Beijing politicians. There's also been a history of collusion between authorities in Hong Kong and the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the Hong Kong police and U.S. policing agencies?
Yeah, so I'm sure you've heard of Chuang. They had a great piece on this kind of collusion between the two powers called the divided God. They basically argue that there's one system of global capitalism, of which the US and China are just two arms that like tear at each other for their meager scraps. And so much of the saber rattling is actually to distract from this fact that it's like the one organism of global capitalism. And, this should be obvious, but I think many refuse to see this. But, one of the most recent and explicit examples that illustrate this is, Trump's executive order ending Hong Kong's special status. The executive order basically means that the US will treat Hong Kong diplomatically, economically, politically the same as it does China. So there's going to be no difference. In the executive order, he also barred Hong Kong's in a State Department international law enforcement agency training program. So it's basically like a global police training camp on, so-called anti-terrorism and so on. So there's clear and explicit proof here that the US State Department is funding the Hong Kong police, who some have described as kind of like, a liberatory socialist police, when in fact one of the mainstream narratives in the US left is that the protesters are funded by the State Department, right? So there has been almost no refutation of this. People just want to kind of ignore this as some inconvenient fact, right? But it goes even further than this when you think about stuff like security technologies. And I thank folks in Lausan for this analysis. Eric Prince of Blackwater, for example, is helping to securitize Xinjiang, for example, in China. Many US tech companies also build or supply technology for the concentration camps in Xinjiang as well, to help speed along the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims. So, global capital exchange really defines the US-China relationship more than this shadow puppetry of, capital D democracy versus capital C communism and this so-called new Cold War.
I don't know how much you and your writing have come across these perspectives and had to push back, but I wonder how much of the tankie presence online is trolls in the service of the Chinese government, like actually literally being paid by China, and how much is Western authoritarian leftists. And do you have any other things you'd like to say to quote-unquote leftists who continue to deny the agency of HongKongers struggling against the silencing of dissent by the Chinese state?
Yeah, tankies hate us. They really hate us. But I think, incidentally, there are less Wu Mao, like the paid trolls, than there are just like really loud Western online leftists who just make it a point to bash us. So, it can be kind of exhausting to try and debate these folks, because when you bring up these facts, like the US State Department funding the Hong Kong police, then they just kind of hem and haw and say, well, it's not that much. Like they only funded them a little bit, or these training camps really don't mean that much. So some of them even go like full mask off and say, well, it's for anti-terrorism purposes, for people who threaten the stability of the Chinese state or the territorial integrity of the Chinese state. So it's a good thing, so it's the goalposts keep moving. And sometimes I go back and forth on how serious of a threat these tankies are, considering many of them don't do any actual organizing in real life. But most recently, one very loud tankie who is well known in organizing circles in New York blocked our collective's participation in some action to support Palestine. So, it's out there. There's actual impact outside of the internet. And that's why I think it's getting more important to build the narratives that can counter this. There are also clearly very large accounts online who have funding from the CCP and who kind of started as mirror images of some of the stuff we're trying to do. And they've built up a huge following because they have institutional support and they have, big name intellectual people supporting them and promoting them. So I think it's time that we recognize how big of a threat they are, especially as this kind of like discourse of Sinophobia, new Cold War, all that stuff is ramping up. There's one coalition or group out there called Pivot to Peace, and their whole guiding mission is, no U.S. war on China, which is like, who would disagree with that, right? Like, yeah, it's a very
reasonable,
innocuous line. But once you click into their site and go into the articles they post, they have posts saying that China had a peaceful rise to power. They say China's not economically colonizing Africa, and all these different kind of like different Chinese nationalist talking points. So I think a lot of these groups are quite clever in the way that they're able to like stealth these talking points into the mainstream, right? By presenting this no war on China as its front and then putting all the other stuff in the background. So, what I would want to get across to leftists in the West who deny HongKonger's agency is that, it's a city of almost 8 million people, and it's a huge number of Hong Kong folks who also reside outside of Hong Kong as well. I just think it's possible to afford HongKongers a modicum of the complexity that these Western leftists afford themselves and their political actions and movements in the West, whereas they want to see HongKongers as a monolith, right? It's like 10 HongKongers who, try and appeal to U.S. Congress, all of a sudden color 8 million people, right? So if people around the world thought all leftists in the U.S. were represented by the actions of the DSA, then I think there would be a lot of unhappy leftists, right? I mean, try telling some leftists that they're represented by anarchists and see what happens. Yeah. So I think that the complexity that people give themselves in the US really needs to be afforded to people outside the US too, right? We're all kind of compromised in many ways by capital. And there's really no way out except through this kind of solidarity and revolution from the bottom. But it doesn't help that Western leftists are going to like look at people around the world and condemn them for the actions of like 10 people, right? So, I'm not going to lie, the left is really marginal in Hong Kong, right? The left is not a central part of the uprising, for sure. But, it's not only because the political spectrum in Hong Kong is radically different from the US, right? Like the left in Hong Kong is associated with the CCP, but also because of the severity of the repression of these groups of the left. Anarchist groups in Hong Kong especially they go extremely underground, they're very insular, and it's because of these security concerns, right, of infiltration, all that stuff. And that's put a damper on the type of impact that they can have, even though we've seen what a huge impact they've had on the 2019 uprising in terms of tactics, in terms of, showing up in Black Bloc and all that stuff. So I think the severe repression is something that all leftists should actually be sympathetic to, right, in the battle against capital. I mean, my understanding of leftism is that you don't abandon comrades who are struggling under authoritarianism, under a capitalist regime, but you do everything to help them build power, right? And what I've seen is people have abandoned the Hong Kong left or just kind of written them out of existence. So, that's what I would ask is people reach out, help the Hong Kong left build power. And, I'm really hoping people can come to this conclusion.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm talking with JN, an anarchist originally from Hong Kong, about the national security law and the state of the uprising there. So in the Ferguson uprising of 2014, there was communication of solidarity and tactics from activists in Palestine who were resisting Israeli apartheid. In the last year, communication between rebels in so-called Chile resisting dictatorship-era laws and neoliberal austerity, combined with those from Hong Kong resisting Chinese imposition, with folks in the streets in the U.S. since the killing of George Floyd, has led to study, shared methods of resistance and street actions here. And I'm sure all that stuff, this sort of like international informing of tactics, methods, and critique is phenomenal. Those, like, there's a big part in my heart that just loves seeing like people taking lasers as demonstrations. And I remember first seeing that showing up in Greece in 2008. And I'm sure it was around before that, but I think the raiding of the Polytechnic like allowed for people to get science grade lasers and push back against the police with that. Suddenly, within a few years, it was showing up in demonstrations, that tactic, around France, as well as around North Africa and West Asia, or the Middle East, during the so-called Arab Spring. I think that there's amazing opportunities that come up when we not only offer solidarity to people that are struggling against authoritarianism and capitalist austerity where they're living. It's a relationship that we build, and we benefit off of it as well. So folks in struggle in the U.S. are quoting the idea, like you said, of be water, for instance, in Portland, while fighting against federal police. Can you talk about interactions and solidarity between street movements in the Hong Kong and the U.S. as you've experienced or witnessed?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up the laser thing, like coming from Greece first, because I also find that so beautiful that, you know, I think it came into a popular consciousness through Hong Kong, but there's no need to kind of like ascribe an origin to that in Hong Kong, right? It was just kind of transformed in that moment because of what was happening on the streets there. But the fact that it came from Greece is just like, you know, it really reminds me of what, you know, a Lebanese dissident, Joey Ayoub, had said to us in an interview with Lausan. He said, you know, the momentum for liberation is never lost. It simply picks up at different speeds in different places and at different times. And I think that's, you know, so much can be said about how these tactics travel and transform in different places. So like, you know, the lasers in Hong Kong, for example, it was like at first a somewhat innocuous thing of just like kind of like pissing off the police. And then one protester got arrested for carrying a laser pointer as like a dangerous weapon. And then that immediately transformed it into this like thing for Hong Kong protesters. It's like, okay, we're going to use the fuck out of these laser pointers, like you said, and, you know, Polytechnic it became an actual, like, the scientific grade ones, right? So, yeah, I think the exchange of tactics is so critical. And, you know, seeing protesters using the phalanx of umbrellas in Seattle to fend off tear gas, it really kind of brought a tear to my eye because it was so familiar. Like, it's like seared into my memory from Hong Kong, but it's jarring to see it in a US context. But I was like, you know, fuck yeah, it's amazing. Like, I really think exchanging these tactics and strategies are some of the best ways to build solidarity across these unequal histories and contexts and spaces, right? Because I think there's a tendency to be like, okay, well, you know, what I talked about earlier of like, oh, you know, Hong Kong protesters are all privileged, bourgeois, whatever, and that's very different from our uprising here in wherever, the US, right? But it's the strategies and the tactics that travel across those divides, right? So, you know, Lausan, for example, we ran a webinar a few months ago with Black Lives Matter organizers where Black folks shared what was going on in the Chaz Chop zone at the time, and then the also kind of like the history of Black radical uprisings and how those two interplayed. And then, you know, the HongKongers who were participating in the webinar shared information about their unionizing drives and also these radical street tactics that folks around the world have found so useful. So, you know, I think this is something we should keep exchanging, since obviously state-sanctioned policing is a global phenomenon now, if it wasn't already for you know, decades, right? And the network of capital that keeps them going. So, for example, like the UK and the US sold tear gas and rubber bullets to the Hong Kong police, while on the other hand decrying Chinese police brutality, right? Like, it's just this extreme hypocrisy. It's important to identify that. The brutality of the police repertoire is mobile, right? The weaponry, the machines, the tactics, you know, kettling, and then now all these different ways to, like, quote unquote, like, use non-lethal, less lethal force on protesters, right? These are extremely mobile and have traveled to sites across the world. So our tactics, our resistance should be as mobile. And I think that, to me, is like the core of the Be Water ethos, is like, just, we need to spread this freely. And this actually helps us to refocus on demands like police abolition. focusing on tactics and strategies, because police abolition became a thing for the first time in Hong Kong's modern history in 2019. It was little reported in mainstream media, but a lot of the protesters had issued a sixth demand, which was to disband the police. And this, disbanding the police meant a lot of different things to different people. It could either mean like reform, we need to like bring in new, better cops or something, or it could mean complete abolition, get rid of police altogether. But it's, precisely the exchange of tactics and histories of these radical movements in the US, across the world, that this webinar that I was talking about tried to foster. And this exchange is what can actually push a disband into abolish.
That's awesome. And that webinar, I've been looking at it for a minute and be thinking I really want to watch it. We featured some of Maya speaking at the North American Anarchist Studies Network conference last year, talking about the challenge that they participated in against the Silent Sam statue in Chapel Hill. And to harken back to an earlier thing that you said also, I was lucky enough to talk with Joy Ayoub earlier this year about the uprisings of last year and their continuation in Lebanon.
Oh, great.
I was listening earlier today to a presentation by a Belarusian anarchist to some German comrades in English, talking about the demonstrations that are ongoing right there. And one thing at one point that he said was, yeah, the police started ramping up their Volkswagens. Thank you, German government, for sending the Belarusian dictatorship vehicles to do this, and started bringing out their Czech-built water cannons. Thank you, Czech Republic, for selling these things. Also, French tear gas, and just named off a bunch of other countries that had sold quote unquote less than lethal implements for crowd control that this dictatorship was using. Capitalism is international. Policing conferences are international. You've got Israel and the US and the UK and all these other countries providing training from their counterinsurgency methods and their policing methods. So it makes total sense for resistance to authoritarian regimes and their lackeys to also go international too, like you say. Yeah. So I've really enjoyed this conversation. I would like to maybe cap off with a question of like, how do you think that folks from abroad can show solidarity with struggles in Hong Kong? And you've named a couple of independent media sources about the situation in Hong Kong, but where can people find Lausan and some of these other good sources for keeping up?
I mean, if folks can read Chinese, then they can go to like thestandnews.com. But I think, like Hong Kong Twitter is really active, and I can't think of any accounts to recommend right now. I guess like for folks who want it in English, they can follow folks like Hong Kong Hermit. He was very involved with the protests, and he has a lot of good commentary there. And then obviously like Lausan is, you can find us at lausan.hk, and then Lausan HK on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But in terms of like solidarity and what folks can do to support Hong Kong, I mean, I think to me it's really about that kind of reorienting the mindset of like giving complexity to the people, right? And not immediately condemning all of the movement and this history of struggle, which has gone on for decades, to just like put it in the garbage because, Joshua Wong talked to Marco Rubio, or like Nathan Law talked to the State Department or whatever, right? And I agree that I don't agree with those actions, but they also, the biggest part of the 2019 movement was what was called like no big stage. That was one of the ethoses, which was like, where there are no leaders, there's no political party guiding this movement. There are no political figures like Joshua Wong telling us what to do. This is actually just a decentralized movement where we decide things on the fly, or we decide things like anonymously. And so allowing those previous figureheads to characterize what went on in 2019 as just, is not connected to reality. And I think it just plays into convenient narratives that folks want to believe. So I think really digging into what's happening on the ground is important. And with how much disinformation is out there, I know it's quite difficult. And the really exciting thing about how many uprisings there are around the world has the flip side of like, how do you keep up with all this stuff, right? And that was one thing I kind of wanted to mention in terms of like all of these uprisings in Lebanon and Belarus. And in Indonesia right now, they're going through days of nationwide protests against neoliberal reform that's being pushed through militarized police. In the Philippines, there's the anti-terror law, which is basically empowering the police to go around killing dissidents. And then obviously the national security laws in Hong Kong, and Thailand with the military crackdown. So it's happening all across Southeast Asia and Asia as well. So, I think being able to find these trusted sources for each uprising is really important, and putting in that effort work to give complexity to each of the uprisings in all of those sites.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation. I've really appreciated it, and I wish you luck and health.
Thanks so much. Great talking to you.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Gunas. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.